Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we're going to talk about Spine 500, Roberto Rossellini's War Trilogy. Italian neorealism. We meet again. Italian neorealism really is, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, the sort of the demarcation point. And really, I think really that, there's several of them. I mean, you could say that Citizen Kane is one of them, but there's just something about Italian neorealism that I feel that can really make the case that where there's cinema before Italian neorealism and cinema after Italian neorealism. And the reason why I would say that this makes the strongest case is that first off, these were films that were not, to use a phrase from Mark Cousins, they were not romantic realism. These were not escapist films. These were not just fantasies of times long past. These weren't attempts to be spectacles or wild rides. That this was really trying to do something that was different. Partly because it was this desire to be honest. Why try to create something spectacular, especially given that World War II happened and it was devastating. So why pretend that we can just create spectacles and fantasies and escapism? And again, those aren't bad. It's just why stick to those? Why not make something that's more sincere and more honest? So partly it was just because of the mood of the time, and the other part of it was there were circumstances that would eliminate some options and then would invite others. I mean, this is what I call the great paradox of creativity, where creativity thrives on both freedom and constraint. You want to have enough freedom to be able to roam around and to try new things, to take advantage of new possibilities and so forth. But it can also be inspired by constraints, limitations. You don't have the studio. You don't have access to certain actors or certain equipment, such as in the case of Rome Open City. Cinecittà Studios was not available, so it helped necessitate the use of using actual locations. But in so doing, it also inspired or helped to inspire a desire to be more authentic in cinema. Why create something in a studio? Why not just use the actual places? Of course, there were some sets that were built, but it wouldn't be filmed in Cinecittà. So from this, you get from all of these things, and I'm sure I probably skipped a few key components, but I think it's because of this. Partly this desire to do something different, partly this desire to be honest in the moment, and in particularly the end of World War II, or certainly what was happening in World War II, and this desire to do something different. You thus get Italian neorealism, and from that you then start to say, well, what else can you do? What else is possible? And again, through the combination of necessity, limitations, advancements in technology, a lot more people who think outside of the box, it then leads to an explosion of new ideas. Now, this is not to say that this wasn't done before World War II. There were plenty of other films and filmmakers that challenged conventions and did some groundbreaking work beforehand. But I think what makes Italian neorealism stand out was that it was one of those right places, right time affairs, where there were a combination of circumstances was just ripe for a change, and it made it easy. It made it easier to do, and furthermore, it made it easier to take in. And then it became its own inspiration, and then it spawned some other films. I think without these films, you wouldn't have some of the other films that came after it. You wouldn't have the French Nouvelle Vague. You wouldn't have the Polish film school movement. You wouldn't have the political films. You wouldn't have cinema verite and everything that pretty much came afterwards. So really, Italian neorealism is a really good demarcation point for the history of cinema. And Roberto Rossellini is one of the architects of this. And here you have 3 films. They weren't intentionally constructed as a trilogy, but they form a trilogy more retroactively because they all deal with World War II. So, first film we're going to talk about is Rome Open City. Now, I think I stated when I talked about Bicycle Thieves that Bicycle Thieves was for a long time my demarcation point of cinema, that there's films before Bicycle Thieves and films after it. And then when I finally got a chance to see Rome Open City, I moved that as the demarcation point, and more because it was first. Bicycle Thieves came out in 1948, and Rome Open City came out in 1945. In revisiting it, I think the case can still be made that Bicycle Thieves is one because it, first off, it's more refined in its techniques than Rome Open City. And again, it's not a fault of it. This was definitely a film made of its time, as I will get into. But I think some of the realist tendencies are more refined in Bicycle Thieves, and I feel that it's a stronger story emotionally without depending so much on conventions, or the conventions are more subtle. They're not as overt as compared to Rome Open City. But nonetheless, I mean, you can use either film, which is why I've said that I think Italian neorealism as a whole can be viewed as a demarcation, and Rome Open City is certainly in the neorealist camp as much as Bicycle Thieves. Now, what's interesting is that Rome Open City also, when you really look at it, it is very melodramatic in its construction. And while it was based on, it was very much rooted in what was happening in Rome in 1944, or 43, 44, when it was right about the time when in Italy at that time, the fascist government was overthrown, and so Mussolini was no longer in power. But this is also where the problems started to begin. The Nazi Germans would come in and try to, to not let Italy fall to the Allies, and trying to pull it back in the Axis camp. So you had a situation where you had both fascists and Germans that were there in Italy, and particularly and especially in Rome. So there was still some resistance and fighting until finally the Allies were able to get into Rome, and Rome was liberated. And then they were chased more further north, and then it all goes on from there. While it was rooted in a very real event, it was still more or less constructed, and it still played to the conventions of melodrama. But that being said, it still depended on a real situation and a real circumstance. So instead of having, because usually melodramas are built on sentiments and emotions, things that are just general experiences. They're just heightened. But here, the basis of it is more in reality. So in that sense, it's kind of a realistic melodrama, or maybe perhaps melodramatic realism. And in that sense, it does kind of fit with Guy Madden's definition of melodrama, that it's not so much life exaggerated, but truth uninhibited. It shows in a very honest and sincere way of what was happening. So anyway, Rome Open City is the story of a engineer who is part of the partisan resistance, against the Germans and the fascists. And of course, the Germans and the fascists want him. They want to stop him, and two, that he could provide information for more resistance to try to crush the rebellion. And there are a lot of death. There are a few notable deaths in this. In fact, one character, Pina, played by Anna Maggini, when we first meet her, she's on the verge of getting married to Francesco, who is another partisan fighter, and she's really looking forward to it in spite of just dealing with the hell of Nazi-occupied Rome and everything else that's been going on in her life. She was really, really looking forward to it. But then there's a moment, and while maybe in some respects it can be considered a spoiler, but at the other hand, I think this is worth spoiling, because I'm just going to say this at the end. There's a scene which I think it's in the category of the most heartrending scenes that you would find in cinema. There's a point where the fascists and the Germans, based on various tip-offs, they would know the location of this engineer and several other partisans, and they go into this one building where Pina lives and others have lived. They surround the building in the morning to get everybody out and to make some arrests. But the scene I'm talking about is Pina discovers that Francesco is one of those who was arrested and captured. And she breaks. She's standing outside the building, kind of in a line in waiting to get back in. But she sees him come out, and she cries for him, and she breaks away from the line. She breaks away from a few other guards to try to run out to the car. And there are those that say, please don't get shot, and they're yelling, they're pleading for her to come back. But she ignores all of this. She breaks through all of that. She chases after the truck that's going away, and she's then shot dead. And her son, one of her sons, Marcello, runs after her, sees it, and pleads for her. And it's very quick. It's very efficient in the way it was shot and edited and put together. And I think the whole sequence lasts for about, I want to say 15-20 seconds. But it all happens in an instant. But it's very, very heartrending. You really, really feel the death of Pina, and likewise the instant mourning of her son Marcello. Now, of course, what's interesting is that everything before that it does build to that moment. It's the way that the film is constructed. It's constructed in two parts, and her death and then subsequently Francesco's and others' rescue by the partisans. They form the first part of the film, and then the second part of the film mostly figures on this priest who ends up helping the partisans, and his, what happens to him, and a few others, which includes, I believe, Francesco and also the engineer. and so in that sense, her death is sort of the great climax. You know, everything is sort of built, and it's like this very gradual, very realistic crescendo of emotions, and then finally hits this great climax, and then it happens again in the second part. Another thing to note about this film is that Don Pedro, the priest who ends up helping out the partisans, he's one of those few. I find this to be a rarity in most cinema, where you have a character who holds a Christian office and who is representing religion and particularly Christianity, but it's done well and it's done positively. I think most of the time I'm very sensitive to sometimes going too far to say it's offensive, but most of the time I'm just, by sensitive I mean very aware, I should say, of the way that Christianity is often portrayed in cinema, and often it's often done. I feel that it's often done in a very disparaging way or in a very insulting way. I'm sure it's not really the case, but this is one of those examples where you have a character who represents Christianity and represents it well and represents it positively. In fact, he's arrested and he's interrogated, and the German soldier who kind of works in cahoots with the police and everything, and who's leading this, who's trying to crush this resistance in Rome, he tries to appeal to his faith by saying, "What you're siding with atheists. I mean, why would you want to be against the people who are against you?" And then Don Pietro replies very well that, I believe that if you value life and justice, you are walking in the ways of the Lord. So in other words, it's that is what's important. It's not, do you believe in God? It's, do you believe in life and the dignity of man? That is my friend. That is my partner. And I thought, well played, well done, sir. And there's also a lot of Christ, and particularly Christ's passion allusions in the tortures and the interrogations that are carried out, and he also plays that really well. So again, it's a nice little trip. The other thing to really note about Rome Open City is that this was actually made. This was filmed in late 1944, and it got first released in January 1945. So, one, that event is still fresh in people's minds, and two, the war was still going on. This was not, and this is what works with the trilogy as a whole, is that everything about it is fresh. It's not. This is not done years after the fact or even decades after the fact. This was done pretty much here and now, or as close to here and now as possible. I mean, obviously, this wouldn't have been filmed during the whole thing. It had to have been done after it was all done. But everything about it was still fresh. The ruins were still there. The feeling of war was still present, even though it was waning away in Rome. There was still fighting going on in Europe at that time, and so it also gives it this energy to it. That still resonates even long after World War II, and that's what makes it so captivating. And this is true with all the films in this trilogy as well. So, so that's Rome Open City, and then the next next film. Oops. Okay, the next film is Paisan, released in 1946. Now, this is continuing on the subject of experimentation. This film is actually a collection of 6 vignettes that are vaguely linked together, but they share a common theme and certainly a common setting. These are all stories that are supposed to take place during the Italian campaign of World War II. And it goes from south to north. The first episode is set in Sicily, the next episode in Naples, then in Rome, then Florence, then a monastery in the Apennine range, and then finally the last one in Portetola in the Po Delta. They're self-contained stories. It's not a situation where characters of one story go into another, and they all deal with, and in addition to the diversity of geography, there's also some diversity of these are all human level stories. You know, these aren't. I mean, they all obviously they're all set in a grand setting and at a grand time, but it's all very, very personal. You have stories of love gain, love loss. You have stories where you start to develop some compassion because you're seeing other people's suffering. You have stories involving communication, certainly between Italians and Americans, and actually that's where the title comes from. Paisan was actually the, from what I understand, it was the term that Italians used to describe Americans that were there. They would think of them as Paisà. Paisà, I think is how you say it. I think that's how I could be wrong on this, but I think that's where the title stems. So there's notions of communication between Italians and Americans, and how do you build bridges? How do you overcome prejudices or preconceptions? In fact, probably the one episode that stands out is the fifth one. That it's actually set in a monastery in the Apennine range, and you have an American soldier and his small little group of officers that are in this monastery, and the monastery finds out that only one of the soldiers is actually Catholic. The other two are Protestant, and one is a Protestant, the other is a Jew. And the monastery wants to... this is in the mindset of trying to convert souls. And then in the end, it realizes that this is a very futile exercise, or that's stupid. It's like, why would you want to do that? That's just ridiculous. It's that notion of this saying is attributed to Augustine, but actually it's not. I'm not going to get into the long history. There's links for this, but the saying that I like is in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. And that's what you come away with in that episode. Now, the reason why I'm being kind of vague about all of this is that it's been a while since I've seen that film, and I feel that it's not the strongest of the films on there. And I think it's because of the structure. But then again, it's more of a feature of the film rather than a bug. I mean, when you have 6 separate stories, some episodes work better than others, but it's another important part of trying to convey a realistic situation and in a real setting, and at the same time you're also experimenting with the form. In fact, this film would sort of set the stage for other films like it, the omnibus films, where it's a string of short films that are strung together by a common theme. This would be very prevalent in the started in the 60s, but this is sort of an early precursor of that, the vignette film, the vignette going for, and it continues. It continues today with other projects like Lumiere and I forget what it's called, but it came out in the 2000s. I know Michael Haneke did a short film of this. I want to say it's 10 Minutes Later is what the overall film was called. But anyways, the omnibus films, where you have a string of short films strung together by a common theme. So this kind of set the stage for that. So, and then finally we get to the third, and that is Germany Year Zero, 1948. if I hadn't said it before, Rome Open City was 1945, Paisan was 1946, and here 1948. Now, what's really interesting about this film is that in a few short years after Rome Open City was made, when the Germans are very clear that they're the enemy, you now have a film that's made about the enemy, but done with sincerity and compassion. This is all about what happened to Germany after World War II. And Germany was in ruins at that point. I mean, between the Allies really took Germany really took a beating by the Allies, especially Berlin, due to the Russians. And again, it was very, very fresh, and people were living in dire hardship and poverty. And this film was meant to showcase what happened. And so again, it's a very, very human story, and that's what makes it really, really appealing. Is it's not trying to make some grand statement. It's not trying to say this overt big message. It's really looking at it. It's really bringing everything down to a human level, and it makes it a much more inviting, much more compelling story than if you were to try to make this big, grand, blanket, universal statement or so forth. Just focus on the human story, and this is a very human story, and it looks at a family. And particularly this young boy, he's about 13 years old, just trying to survive in Berlin. He's trying, he's avoiding school. He wants to work to try to provide for his family. He has a older sister who, in so many words, resorts to prostitution to try to get some items so that she can get some items from the black market to again help her family. He has an older brother who was, I believe he was in the Wehrmacht and is actually in hiding. He doesn't want to register because he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want to be implicated for any other crimes that he may or may not have committed. So he also has an older father who is in ill health and is trying to keep everybody together. Mother was long dead in this, so it's just this family trying to survive, trying to deal with maintaining the power, getting food, with trying to feed 4 people with 3 ration cards because the older brother doesn't want to register himself and therefore he doesn't get a ration card. So it's trying to feed 4 using 3. And everything is scarce, and there's this it's really, really bad. And then also what makes it complicated is that this boy Edmund, he meets his old teacher who still has traces of National Socialism in his thinking, and also in so many words it's implied that he's a pedophile too. It's not totally overt, but you see there's lots of little clues in his actions and with whom he associates with that kind of comes through. So it's really, really bad, and it just gets worse throughout the whole thing. It's not, there's no happy ending at all. But it's sad but true. In a certain respects, and also what gives this film another certain weight is that at the time one of Roberto Rossellini's sons, Romano, had died. In fact, part of the casting of Edmund was inspired by his son. He wanted someone who resembled a lot of his son, and so it also gives it a certain weight. While in a certain sense it is still constructed by conventions of melodrama, the melodrama seems to be more subverted in this compared to Rome Open City. It's much more realistic in the setting. Although I believe it was also, while it was actually done in locations, there was some studio setups, and I think some of the backgrounds were actually rear projections, but they were actually filmed in Berlin, in some respects. So, there's some on location stuff, but again, it's all infused. It's all informed by this real scenario. It's Berlin after World War II, and all the crap that went on after that time. So, I think it goes without saying, I definitely recommend these films, and I would even go as far as to say that this is essential viewing. If you care about cinema, if you want to know something about the history of cinema, these are staple films, and I feel very, very important films, because it opens the possibilities of what cinema can do. It's you no longer feel like it has to be these kinds of stories or these kinds of settings or these kinds of characters. The palette is starting to broaden a bit more, and then over time, after these films, the palette just gets more and more broader, and it becomes more and more exciting to see what else you can do. And these films. And again, Bicycle Thieves is also in this category too, would help expand that palette. So in that sense, it's essential viewing as far as cinema is concerned, and also it's essential viewing because it does allude to World War II. It's all set in the midst of World War II, where it's very, very fresh. Again, these were not films that were made years after the fact or even decades after the fact. Actually, it's interesting. A couple of days ago, I finally got a chance to see Downfall, and so there you have a film that's about the last days of Berlin. Again, it's set in Hitler's bunker. So, and yes, yes, I know where that meme. Yes, I know that's where that meme originates. But again, this was made in 2004. So this was decades long after the event. And while that film was certainly very, very good, especially Bruno Gantz's performance as Hitler, and yes, I forgot to mention that when I talked about The Wings of Desire. You go from compassionate angel in love with a trapeze artist to Hitler. Talk about range as far as your acting abilities. So while the performances were all very good, and also Alexander Maria Lara's performance was also really good, and it was well shot, well made. But when you know that Rome Open City and Paisan and Germany Year Zero were made just mere years after World War II happened, there's a certain freshness to it. And again, it's not to say that Downfall is bad. It's just that I think if you really want to get some sense of what happened, these are great films to look at, because it captured it very as honestly and truthfully as possible. Was it perfect? No, and that's just because nothing can ever be really captured perfectly. But given what they could do and what they want to do, I think it does as good of a job as any, and certainly the best, possibly the only time where you really get that sense. And so this was a case where it was right time, right place for it to happen, and for that there's a great gratitude to be placed on Roberto Rossellini for doing that. So, essential viewing if you haven't seen it. So go see it, especially Rome Open City and Germany. We'll see all of them, but especially note Rome Open City and Germany Year Zero. And that was Roberto Rossellini's War Trilogy. And until next time, take care.